Okay, and welcome to part three of the rest of the story to the social justice narrative. And today we're going to be digging in deeper, trying to get that understanding. So, what we're going to do right now is look at a couple of books from the social justice narrative. The first being White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and then Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. Now, the other stories, the other side of the story, will come from primarily Thomas Sowell. There will be a few ideas brought in by other prominent Black figures such as Shelby Steele, Larry Elder, and Jason Riley. And this isn't going to be, comprehensive. There are so many books on both sides. I couldn't possibly do that. But I just want to get, a flavor for how the thoughts are developed in the two camps here, two sides. Now, we are not going to get to any way forward here, but that's ultimately where we want to go. Now, as I mentioned, we're only going to look at two titles from the social justice narrative today, but I just want to remind you that the two that we're looking at have been on the New York Times bestsellers list for years. And at one point this year, of the top 15, over half of them were on this topic of social justice. So many Americans are reading these books. Some are exploring the ideas, some are digging deeper, but these are very relevant and pervasive ideas. So that's why we're going to look at it today. All right, so the first book we're going to talk about is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. So she's a sociologist, and she went around the country giving presentations about racism, primarily to white people. And she just noticed that whites exhibited this behavior she called fragility. And it's a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. It's a posture of defensiveness and hypersensitivity that perpetuates white dominance. So that last part, white dominance, you know, this book is littered with the social justice jargon, things like their redefinition of racism, their redefinition about white privilege, their redefinition of white supremacy. And it is just a basic assumption that whites dominate all other people groups. And they are trying to maintain that dominance. And that's what causes this fragility. Now, we take a step back. If there were real racism going on, say you had a member of the KKK and you confronted them with their racism, I am sure that they would be defensive and hypersensitive and intolerable. So white fragility as a concept is real. And even somebody who isn't so blatantly racist as what we think of as a white supremacist KKK member, but still harbors some ill will towards blacks, even they may feel defensive. Nobody likes to have their faults pointed out. But the issue here is that this book generalizes that to all whites. If you're white, you exhibit white fragility. And it's because they know your motive. You're trying to maintain your power. But the only way that they can know your motive is if they were God. And that's why this is a logic error. And C.S. Lewis is the one who coined the term Bulverism for this particular logic error. They cannot just disregard everything that a white person is saying because of their supposed motive, because they cannot know the motive of every individual. It's impossible. But they do this to place whites in a trap. So you either admit that you're racist and fragile, or, because you're exhibiting this fragility, that's demonstrating that you're racist and fragile. The very fact that you deny that you're racist means that you are a racist and exhibiting fragility. So it's this fundamental logic problem that I find very pervasive in this whole genre of books, and a fundamental flaw. That doesn't mean that everything that they say is wrong. Like I said, even this concept of white fragility is real, but the extrapolation of all of these concepts to everyone, everywhere, that I think is the fundamental flaw. And that's just my idea, okay? I'm not pulling that from somewhere else. And as I've told you before, I can be wrong. Go read other books, go examine this stuff yourself. But this is just me talking. Now, a much longer book on this topic is Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. And the subtitle is The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And that's really what this book is about. Although he does talk about, racist practices, such as slavery, Jim Crow, the book is really about developing the idea that racist ideas were conjured up in order to justify all of those different behaviors, and they become so ingrained into the American culture that we don't even recognize that they are there. And that what has fueled discrimination. And he says that now we've got a hard time recognizing that racial discrimination is the sole cause of racial disparities in this country and the world at large. So previously we had talked about, the two sides of the debate of what is causing the disparities, one being personal responsibility and the other structural racism, or in this case he's calling it discrimination. So obviously Kendi is totally discounting anything to do with personal responsibility. He is saying the sole cause is the structural racism. And it's only because of those racist ideas that we even might think that personal responsibility is an issue. So he goes on to say, I am saying that there is nothing wrong with Black people as a group or with any other. No racial group has ever had a monopoly on any type of human trait or gene, not now, not ever. And certainly from what we know about genetics, that is certainly true, that nobody's got a monopoly on anything. But then he continues on, all cultures, in all of their behavioral differences are on the same level. And Black Americans' history of oppression has made Black opportunities, not Black people, inferior. So he is extending this idea of personal responsibility being completely irrelevant and expanding it to the idea that even the cultural aspects that any particular group might adopt, they are irrelevant, that everybody should have these same outcomes regardless of how they view personal responsibility and what kind of culture that they have. Now, this to me is very dangerous and, again, a logical inconsistency. If we just, think of culture as an analogy, say a hammer. And if one culture had a rock that they simply tied onto a stick with a string, and another group had a steel hammer like we're used to today, which one would be more effective? Clearly the steel hammer. So different outcomes would be expected between the two groups. Culture can be the exact same thing. Now, I'm not talking about something like, what kind of hairstyle you have, but all cultural aspects are what he is referring to here. So even such things as, whether you have two parents in a home, and he even in this book makes a large point that things like gangster rap, which almost idealize the gangster lifestyle, that's a good cultural aspect. So he totally dismisses that it can have any negative repercussions on society as a whole. So he's saying that is all irrelevant. And if we can go to certainly extremes and think of cultures like the Mayans that practiced human sacrifice, are we really going to say that that is on the same level as our society today? What about groups that have been cannibals? Is that the same? Or what about mutilation? Now, certainly these three examples that I've talked about here are extremes, but it shows that the statements that he's making, all cultures and sole cause, they're simply logically inconsistent with what we know. Now, yes, we have to figure out what cultural differences are relevant to behavioral differences, but we know that they must exist. So he continues along this same line, again saying that if you believe all the racial groups are equal, it's racial discrimination is the cause of all the disparities. And I just talked about, I think that's logically inconsistent, and yet at the beginning of this book, he already has a rejoinder to me. He's just saying that no logic or fact or history book can change people like me, because logic and facts and scholarship have little to do with why they are expressing racist ideas in the first place. And he would say, what I have just shared with you is a racist idea. So he just labels those sort of people as closed-minded, cunning, and captivating producers of racist ideas. Now, the way the book is set up, he uses these 5 different personalities to represent different eras in which racist ideas have been developed and promulgated. The first being Boston preacher Cotton Mather. So we certainly think of this nation as being founded under God. And so he starts out with Cotton Mather and how he sort of justified this idea of slavery at the time and Christian morals. He then moves into Thomas Jefferson, of course, wrote the Declaration of Independence, most of the Constitution. So that's why he uses him as an example. Then William Lord Garrison, who was an editor of The Liberator, which was basically like an abolitionist newspaper that did a lot to shape people's thoughts leading up to the Civil War. Then W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an NAACP member and a prolific author and shaped a lot of people's thoughts. And finally, Angela Davis, who was a thinker and a college professor over most of her life, but also a Communist Party leader. So like I said, this is all about showing origins and evolution of racist ideas. And these characters, at times they aren't even the primary focus of the book. So we have to deal with the title of Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning, and it comes from Jefferson Davis. He was objecting to a bill funding black education in Washington, D.C. in 1860. And he said this government was not founded by Negroes nor for Negroes, but by white men for white men. The inequality of the white and black races was stamped from the beginning. So, clearly Jefferson Davis had bought into this whole thought that there's something inherently wrong with blacks, and that is why they're in the position that they are in, and there's nothing that can change that. So, this is as racist of an idea as you can possibly have. And, that is what fueled the thought processes of Jefferson Davis and why he led the Confederate States. And you can find many examples of people who totally bought into that racist mindset. So Kendi says that for 6 centuries, there hasn't always been a persistent line of anti-racist thought in this country. Now, the first thing I say, for 6 centuries, that he is talking about the United States, and this book only refers to the United States. It gives absolutely uh, little emphasis to anything outside the history of the United States. The next thing is he starts bringing in these ideas of categories of racism. So he says there are assimilationists and segregationists. So we need to get some idea of what he is meaning about those. But anti-racists are the ones who give hope, and they have long argued that racial discrimination was stamped from the beginning of America. So again, part of the premise of this book is the United States was founded on racism. Now, assimilationists first used the term racism in the 1940s, but they refused to define their own ideas of Black behavioral inferiority as racist. So really what he does is he is setting up a spectrum of racism. At one end, you have the anti-racists. At the other end, you have the segregationists. So segregationists, they believe there's some sort of Black biological inferiority or something similar to that. There's just something inherent about Blacks that makes them inferior. Assimilationists are in between the two. So typically they think that there is something wrong with Blacks, but they can uplift themselves out of that state. There's something that they need to change, whether it be educational or values, culture, and that's the Black behavioral inferiority that he's talking about as being racist. So, reiterating what we just saw, we have segregationists. There's something inherent about Blacks that makes them distinct and inferior. Assimilationists, they do struggle against racial discrimination, but they do partly blame Blacks themselves for some of those disparities. And then anti-racists themselves, who say different skin colors, hair textures, behaviors, and culture, the ways that Blacks and whites are on the same level and equal in all of their divergences and should result in equal outcomes for their groups. And he gives the example of police killings, and the three sides of the arguments, he says, are on full display with these three groups. So segregationists have blamed the criminal behavior of the Black people who were killed by the police officers. Anti-racists have been blaming the recklessly racist behavior of the police, and assimilations have tried to have it both ways, saying both acted irresponsibly. Now, one thing we need to realize is all of these groups, assimilationists, segregationists, and anti-racists, they're not a permanent state. People can, a single person can, even within one sentence, say something that is segregationist, assimilationist, or anti-racist. But many people that we would think led the fight against racism, he would put in the assimilationist camp, including people like Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King Jr., and even President Obama. So there actually are very few people, the historical figures, that Kendi would actually praise as being truly anti-racist. Now, one thing that I think Kendi does a pretty good job of in his book is present us with what I'm titling a study in dehumanization. So these are basically racist ideas that dehumanize the Blacks. And because this is mostly about the West in the United States, Kendi points to this event in 1452 when someone named Sir Ra was commissioned to write about the life and slave trading work of his uncle, Henry the Navigator, which you may recall from history. So in this book, Zurara indicated that Africans were just barbarians and they needed both religious and civil salvation. And he says that his uncle would seize the captives for the purpose that he reflected with great pleasure upon the salvation of those souls that before were lost. So religiously, they were lost, and now they are given the opportunity to know about Christ. But they, these people, they just not only were they spiritually lost, they lived like beasts without any custom of reasonable beings. And what's more, they have no knowledge of bread or wine, and they were without covering or clothes or the lodgment of houses. And worse than all, they had no understanding of good, but only how to live in bestial sloth. Yet, when they became slaves and went to Portugal, their lives were quite the contrary. Everything had changed for them. So, this state of being a slave in Portugal was portrayed as being an improvement over their free state in Africa. So these ideas were extended by someone who came to be known of as Leo Africanus. So around 1518, a Moroccan man with this very long name, he was actually captured and enslaved on a diplomatic voyage in the Med. And in 1521, Pope Leo X actually freed him, converted him to Christianity, and renamed him Johannes Leo. And because he was African, that's how he came to be known as Leo Africanus. Well, people believe that Leo commissioned him to write a survey of Africa, since that's where he was from. And in 1526, he published the first European scholarly survey of Africa, called The Description of Africa. And he described the etymology, the origins of Africa, and then surveyed African geography, languages, cultures, religions, and diseases. So most people don't believe he actually went everywhere that he wrote about, but he did write this extensive book, which again, you can look up yourself. So some of his observations. So there is no nation under heaven more prone to venery, that's sexual indulgence. And many of the ideas that even persist today about the sexual prowess of blacks come from this observation of Leo Africanus. I've even heard these within the past year. So it just shows how persistent some of these ideas have been. And similar to what we saw with Zurara, Africans lead a beastly kind of life, being utterly destitute of the use of reason, of dexterities of wit, and of all arts. They behave themselves as if they had continually lived in a forest among wild beasts. So again, very negative sort of observations about how they live, that they're just the next things to the animals, and any kind of exposure to Europeans would be a step up. But he also, even in this book, he addresses the question of how he could write so homely of Africa when he himself was an African, both by birth and even by education, his initial education. And it just says that he considered himself to be a historiographer, charged with telling the plain truth in all places. Well, this book was read extensively in Europe, and it reinforced the ideas of Zurara, of hypersexuality, that they're being next to animals, beastly, and the lack of reason. And a point I want to make is this just demonstrates the power of the media, even in the 16th century. Then it was through books, but it did a lot to shape the thoughts of a lot of people, even way back then. So let's skip quite a ways forward to Thomas Jefferson. If you read the section about Cotton Mather, it's mostly about, here is a preacher who's again pushing these ideas of, we're giving the Africans an advantage because they now are getting exposed to knowledge of God. And even though, preachers like Mather did say that, slaves were to be treated well, they were still slaves. And there is absolutely no room for anyone to accept slavery and be at all acceptable in this genre of literature. Doesn't matter what the extenuating circumstances are. If they weren't full out condemning slavery and giving up their lives to end it, they're racist. Same is true of Jefferson. The other thing is, you might ask, well, why did he pick Cotton Mather? Most of you probably don't even know who this guy is, and even why Jefferson. It's because these guys wrote a lot. He needs material to use, but this also means that he's got a very small sample to choose from, because the majority of people didn't write prolifically like a Cotton Mather and a Thomas Jefferson. Even amongst these individuals who wrote so much, he didn't share everything that I think is relevant. So that's why I'm going to pick on Thomas Jefferson here, because although he does say a few sort of not negative things about Thomas Jefferson, most are pretty negative, and he leaves out some things that I'll share from another book, which I think are rather positive. And I'm sure Kendi would have been aware of these because many of them were in books written by Booker T. Washington. So, he acknowledges that Jefferson was raised in the sight of Native Americans and actually viewed them pretty positively. But he says that African people were just houseworkers and they tended to tobacco. He also makes note that the First Great Awakening basically bypassed the plantation Shadwell, where he grew up. So his father, Peter Jefferson, didn't allow the preacher to speak to any of his children. And yeah, I'd say that's actually kind of relevant. But despite that, Thomas Jefferson was basically a humanist. I mean, he did have exposure to religious ideas, but he's not what we would call an ardent believer. He had his own Bible that he cut up into pieces because he didn't believe a lot of it and threw that part out. So, he's playing origami with the Bible. So even though he was basically a humanist, and as it says here, he imported a lot of Enlightenment racist ideas, he still came to the conclusion that slavery was wrong. And I think this is important. Now, even before the war, in a summary view of the rights of British America, Jefferson wrote that, one of the problems with the British is that, they're making all these laws for Americans, and they had rejected the desire of Americans to abolish slavery and the slave trade, and thus disregard the rights of human nature. Now, some people would assume that this was just political maneuvering, and that's probably true to some extent. You can see that, it says some politicians folded over in disgust as they took in Jefferson's rhetorical gunshot at slavery. But others admired this clever turn where he had blamed England for American slavery. But it was widely circulated. But, the tone of Stamped is that, Jefferson is just using this as a political ploy. And to some extent, that may be true. So he goes on to say, that whatever thoughts there were of abolishing slavery in these nascent days of the the Republic, it was mostly just hypocrisy, a bit of pragmatism for the country. They were talking about freedom at the same time dismissing their own atrocities against enslaved Africans. And that's true. And Samuel Johnson was from Britain, one of their leading thinkers and philosophers, and he called out at these Americans on this hypocrisy and even referred to the Americans as having greedy rushes for wealth and their dependence on enslavement and their way of teaching Christianity to make blacks docile. And he said, I am willing to love all mankind except an American. There's even talk about Benjamin Franklin, who also argued that England was enslaving Americans. And, Samuel Johnson also took exception to that and, said that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of the Negroes. So someone had to answer all of these claims by Samuel Johnson with the Revolutionary War being soon upon this country, and that person was Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, obviously with the help of others, but it starts out with all men are created equal. And Kennedy does admit that it's impossible to know for sure whether Jefferson meant to include his enslaved laborers or even women in all men. But he says, even if Jefferson believed all groups to be created equal, he never believed the anti-racist creed that all human groups are equal. But still, his all men are created equal was revolutionary, and Kennedy admits that that helped propel states like Vermont and Massachusetts to abolish slavery. So I don't know if you know that, but it was shortly after this 1777 or 78 that Vermont and Massachusetts abolished slavery. But at the same time, 6 southern slaveholding states inserted all freemen are created equal into their constitutions. So, even as early as 1776, there is clear distinction between the North and the South. Thomas Jefferson also talked about men being endowed by their Creator with inherent and inalienable rights that are among these of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But Jefferson did own slaves, so Kennedy is hard on him. It says it's not hard to figure out what the Native Americans and enslaved Africans and indentured white servants meant when they demanded liberty in 1776. And at other times, Jefferson again accused the English crown of arming enslaved Africans to maintain British enslavement over Americans. And this time, an anti-slavery Puritan, Pastor Samuel Hopkins, responded by saying that the so-called enslavement of the Americans was lighter than a feather compared with Africans' enslavement to Americans. And his anti-racist pamphlets, so Kennedy even says that these words of Hopkins were anti-racist, actually may have overshadowed the Quakers' demand in 76 for all friends in the Quaker Church to either free their slaves or face banishment from the church. So, there is an acknowledgement here of, in 76, some Puritans and the Quakers who were opposing slavery. So, here he's back to basically, saying that Jefferson is just trying to use these ideas, all men are created equal, inalienable rights, to help out his wealthy white male revolutionaries. And he criminalized runaways in the Declaration of Independence, and he silenced women. And Kennedy does bring up that there were thousands, many thousands of Africans who joined the British during the Revolutionary War. Some just ran away, tried to set up their own governments. And, in some states, 20,000, 30,000. So this was a lot of them. So, these ideas that, blacks couldn't do anything on their own, uh, the fact that they were able to take up arms with the British, I don't know how successful they were at setting up their own governments, but, you know, there were many people who said we can't free blacks because they're, too animalistic to govern themselves. This would have been an example where they could have looked to this time period and seen that they could have. Now, Jefferson did propose what Kennedy calls a frontal attack on slavery in Notes on the State of Virginia. So you may have heard of Alexis de Tocqueville. Um, he was a Frenchman who wrote a book about the United States, and he had asked people for contributions, and Jefferson wrote Notes on the State of Virginia. And this was a plan that Jefferson would endorse for the rest of his life. It involved mass schooling, emancipation of blacks, and colonization. Now, this colonization part is what Kennedy would say is still racist, and it never really worked and probably was doomed from the beginning. But it was the idea you would either send them back to Africa or to some Caribbean island or to South America. And in this, Jefferson does say that although black people had a memory on par with whites, in reason they were much inferior. So, Kennedy says, that was Jefferson's mindset, that they were just an inferior people, and even though they could produce, people that could speak, could do elementary painting and sculpture, he said they couldn't produce a poet. So still, this idea that Jefferson just was denigrating blacks. And he even takes aim at George Washington because he refused to join an anti-slavery campaign in 1785. And, he said it would just be dangerous to make this frontal attack on slavery, with this new country. It's obvious that when this country finally did decide to confront the evils of slavery, it split the country. And Washington, Jefferson, these others knew that. But, Kennedy says that Washington was simply sounding one of the first drum beats of supposed racial progress to drown out the passionate arguments of anti-racism. Anti-racism would have said, it doesn't matter what the consequences are, we must eliminate slavery and we must do it now. And it's easy for us to say today when we know that the country had to go through the Civil War. But you have to ask the question, would this country have even survived if it had gone through a civil war, in 1776 when they tried to have the Revolutionary War, or even in 1785? These are the issues, the real issues that somebody like Washington and Jefferson had to deal with. Now, the book does emphasize the importance of the Haitian Rebellion that occurred in the late 1700s up until 1804 when they finally overthrew the French. But it's mostly because it instilled so much fear in the colonies that some sort of revolution could also occur in the United States. And it prompted a lot more control measures to make sure that such a rebellion would not take place, or if it started, they could stamp it out. But the book never really tells the full story of the Haitian Rebellion. It started in 1791. and this rebellion broke out in 1792. The French actually sent troops to reestablish control. And it was actually in 1792 you've got the French Revolution going on, and they actually did abolish slavery at that time. France was still in control of the island, and there was even though people weren't slaves at the time, there was still a an attempt at separation from French rule. But in 1802, Napoleon reinstitutes slavery and sends troops, but many of them die from yellow fever. But they do manage to capture the Haitian leader Louverture, and General Dessalines fights on. And it's estimated hundreds of thousands of Europeans and ex-slaves die in this revolt. And Bonaparte just gives up on this idea of Western expansion. He's dealing with a lot of troubles back in Europe. So he abandons the island of Saint Domingue. It was originally under Spanish control. And he even sells the Louisiana Territory to the United States. So the island is declared under the native name of Haiti, and Dessalines proclaims himself Emperor for life as Emperor Jacques I by his troops. And at first, he offers protection to the white planters and others on the island. However, once in power, he orders the massacre of nearly all white men, women, and children. At least 3,000 up to 5,000 whites were killed, including those who had been friendly and sympathetic to the black population. He went around and made sure that they were executed, even when local blacks who had been supported by them didn't want it to happen. He then reinstituted the plantation system. So, people weren't slaves, they were getting paid, but very little. And many Haitians were marginalized and they resented it. And the rebel movement splintered, and Dessalines himself was assassinated in 1806. A couple important points to realize here is that just because somebody is a member of an oppressed group, these people were enslaved there, that doesn't mean that they're going to behave any better than their previous masters. And secondly, the fear that many in the United States had was that if there were this black uprising, or even if you just freed a lot of the blacks, you'd end up with a similar massacre as what occurred in Haiti. And after Dessalines died, his two subordinates split the island up. Things didn't improve all that much. And in 1809, you had 9,000 refugees from the island fled to New Orleans. And that's why there's that strong influence, Haitian culture, voodoo, that sort of thing in New Orleans. Now, there's certainly much more in Kendi's book than I have presented, but I think we've already seen what are the major premises in the book. This idea of the development of racist ideas, how they originated and how they evolved in the United States, and also what Kendi defines as segregationists, assimilationists, and anti-racists in that spectrum. So I'm not going to go through the rest of the book. I'll leave it up to you. I also will mention his other book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which really is his own personal history of how he developed anti-racist mindset. And it gives you a lot of insight into his thought processes and how he also views the policy as being the primary means as which we can make improvement, which goes, I think, along with his whole premise that's presented in Stamp from the beginning. You know, personal responsibility is completely de-emphasized. It's all about the group, and it's not about the group's culture. So if you've gotten rid of personal responsibility and you've gotten rid of culture, the only thing that is really left is the structural side, and you address that through policy. And so that's the main emphasis of how to be an anti-racist. It's about being either an ally and advocate for these sorts of structural changes through governmental policy, or you're one who's actively trying to create those new governmental policies. So now we're going to move into what I'm calling the other side of the story. And I will say that, it's primarily, as far as I'm concerned, omissions. The book had a premise, racist ideas, and that is developed within the book. But when I started out, I said whoever speaks first seems right. And if you just read this book, you will think, oh, he does a very good job, convincing job of getting you to buy into this racist idea narrative. And I think there's probably a lot of truth to it. But to get the full picture, I think we need to look at some omissions that the book did not address. And I will say that was not the purpose of the book, and also the book is already very long. Like I said, I listened to this thing, it's 19 hours. But for us trying to get a complete picture of what's going on, we really need to address these omissions. And that's what hopefully we will do. So let's first just look at some words of President Barack Obama when he was still a senator. He gave a speech in 2008 that was on Father's Day. And what he said was the family is what is most important. It's a rock for what we build upon. And we need to recognize and honor how critical every father is to that foundation. But at the same time, too many fathers are missing, and in particular in the Black societies. And why is this so important? Because children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. Obviously, this is all about a culture. If the culture says you don't need the father around, then most likely most people in that community are not going to have fathers around. And that's what Obama was calling out here. And I think we need to understand what the ramifications are for this cultural mindset before we say that, this particular cultural aspect of, single parent households are fine and it's equal on all levels with everything else. We need to know what the ramifications are for that cultural mindset. And Obama here is calling those out. Now, Obama went on to say that we need more cops on the street. And interestingly enough, in August of 2020, in a Gallup poll, it showed that 81% of Blacks actually want more police spending time in their neighborhoods, which goes completely against a lot of the rhetoric that we're hearing right now. But the reality is everybody wants to feel safe. And if police are doing their job properly, that does help and contribute to it. But as Obama noted, even more important than having police and better schools and better jobs and better opportunities is having fathers that realize that they have a responsibility throughout the life of their children to instill an ethic of excellence in children, to pass along the value of empathy, and finally, the gift of hope. And I think that, all of these are so critical, especially hope. which is exactly the opposite of this sort of victimization mentality. Now, another omission from Kendi's book is really the throughout time history of slavery. And I think we really need to at least get a cursory understanding of that to see how it plays into the whole concept of these racist ideas. And, I don't care what source you go and look at, everything is going to agree that evidence of slavery predates written records. It's existed in almost all cultures and people groups. So it is by no means unique to the West or the United States. And even in the West, there was slavery going on long before Europeans had any contact with blacks. And in fact, the word slave is derived from Slav. So Slavic peoples were the most common slaves up until, around the 1400s. And one thing you will find is kind of a dearth of commentary about slavery, other than it existed and it was practiced. But one exception to that is from Greece in 330 BC. Aristotle wrote about it. And he said, hey, it's just and it's beneficial for both the slave and for the owner if the enslaved is one that he calls a natural slave. So they lack the capacity to deliberate. And it's not advantageous for one to be held in slavery if they're not this natural slave, because otherwise there will be enmity between the two. But Asiatics, who were common slaves in Greece, he said, are naturally slavish because they lack spirit due to the warmth of their climate. Now that may sound very strange to you, but this is the origins of what was known as the climate theory, that people who were from southern, very hot climates did not develop mentally, and that's also why they had darker skin. But if they were to migrate up into the cooler northern climates, then both their skin color and their mental capacity would improve. So, that is a very old racist idea, and it was started with Aristotle. Now, an important point, as I mentioned, is that most cultures have almost no literature that discuss the justifications for slavery. Why? Because it was just considered a settled issue without any moral implications. So we have to ask ourselves, why did Europeans start writing about it so much that Kendi would have all this material? Something unique was going on in those Western civilizations. And that actually helped to lead about, I think, the abolition of slavery. Now, let's talk a little bit more about specifically African slave trade, since that is the major emphasis of Kendi's book and, for us in the United States. Many other people groups, even within the continent of Africa, were engaging in the slave trade long before Europeans got anywhere near there. So Egyptians, Ethiopians, they had many slaves. And there was at least 10 centuries of slavery for the benefit of Muslim countries. And slaves were often exported across the Sahara Desert with an extremely high mortality rate. They also went across the Red Sea, and they went from the Indian Ocean ports and across the Atlantic. And 4 million enslaved people were exported across the Red Sea, another 4 million through the Swahili ports of the Indian Ocean, and perhaps as many as 9 million along the Sahara. And the Arab slave trade lasted more than a millennium, and as recently as the 1960s, Saudi Arabia's slave population was estimated at 300,000. And along with Yemen, the Saudis abolished slavery finally in 1962. Now, Europeans actually learned of the African slave trade because of Muslims and Barbary pirates. And these Barbary pirates were actually taking Europeans as slaves, as well. And the transatlantic slave trade Um, it actually was called the triangular trade. So arms, textiles, and wine were shipped from Europe to Africa, slaves from Africa to the Americas, and sugar, coffee, tobacco, cotton from the Americas to Europe. And the estimates are somewhere between 10 and 12 million traveled blacks, slaves, traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. And it peaked around the 18th century. And most of those slaves, the overwhelming majority, were actually captured by African kingdoms. And there's a few of them that were listed here. And this was actually the most brutal and highest mortality portion of the whole practice of slavery. It's estimated that 15% of slaves died journeying over to the Americas, but the mortality rates were considerably higher in Africa itself in the process of capturing people, because basically it was war, and then transporting them to the coast where they could be picked up by these ships. So the whole process of enslaving was really rather barbaric. So what is it in the West that started people really thinking about slavery as a moral issue? So I'm only going to be presenting one particular vein of thought, but there were many humanists who actually, coming out of the Renaissance, who were thinking about slavery as being something that is wrong. It just does not help society. But because some of the primary characters in the abolitionist movement were actually religious, I'm going to emphasize that. So it was the first Great Awakening. It was an evangelical revival. There was really a series of revivals that swept across Britain and the American colonies in the 1730s and 1740s. And, the likes of George Whitefield, John Wesley, Jonathan Edwards were involved. And it involved preaching and personal conviction that people needed salvation by Jesus Christ. And it really fostered introspection and commitment to a new standard of personal morality. It told people you couldn't have this total disconnect between what you said you believed and what you lived. And that was kind of a very revolutionary idea. And this revival theology, it really told them it's not just intellectual assent to doctrine, but a new birth experienced in the heart that allowed you to live it out. And they also sought to include every person in conversion, regardless of gender, race, and status. So it wasn't just for elitists, it wasn't just for whites, it was for everyone. And in the American colonies, especially in the South, the revival movement is really when a significant number of African slaves started to be converted to Christianity. And many slaveholders at this time actually started to allow their slaves to be educated so that they could read and study the Bible. Now, by no means did this become, uh, law in the land, and it probably wasn't even the majority of slaves were being educated, but at least some were. So in England, where most of these thoughts grew the fastest and soonest, one of the primary characters is John Newton, and he wrote Amazing Grace. That's probably how you know of him the best. But in 1743, at age 18, he was basically enslaved by the Royal Navy. And he tried to desert, and he was flogged and then transferred to another ship, which was a slaver that was bound for West Africa. And he got in contact, well, he was basically sold to this Amos Clow, and he gave Newton to his wife, this Princess Pay, who was of the Sherbro, Native African people. And she abused Newton as much as she did any other slave. And Newton recounted he was once an infidel, and a libertine, a servant of slaves in West Africa. So he experienced slavery himself. But in 1748, he was finally rescued by a sea captain that Newton's father had paid to search for him. And on the return journey to England, Newton had a spiritual conversion. They were in the midst of a storm, and he just prayed about God's mercy. And this did actually have a significant impact on his life. He began to read the Bible and other religious literature, and it got him thinking about and then accepting evangelical Christianity. And that from that point on, he avoided profanity, gambling, and drinking. But he actually continued to work in the slave trade himself, even though he had gained significant sympathy for slaves from his time in Africa as a slave. But he said his true conversion did not happen until later. I cannot consider myself to have been a believer in the full sense of the word until a considerable time afterwards. So Newton spent a significant number of time working in this slave trade. And it wasn't, and he worked his way up and even became a captain of slave ships. But in 1754, he suffered a stroke and had to give up seafaring, and he became a tax collector. And then he applied to become a priest in the Church of England. But it took 7 years before he actually was accepted. In 1787, so there's quite a few years passed here after he became a pastor, but he became an ally of William Wilberforce, who was the leader of a parliamentary campaign to abolish the African slave trade. And Newton had not said very much about slavery prior to this, but he broke his long silence in 1788 with the publication of a pamphlet called Thoughts Upon the Slave Trade, in which he described the horrific conditions of the slave ships during the Middle Passage. He apologized for a confession which comes too late. He said, it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders. So part of the reason for his silence was simply his shame. But this pamphlet became very popular in England. Copies were sent to every member of Parliament, and it helped contribute to the changing of the mindset in England. We already mentioned William Wilberforce. Well, he began his political career in 1780. He was an independent member of Parliament for Yorkshire. And his conversion came in 1785, and again, it resulted in major changes in his life. But in 1787, he came in contact with anti-slave trade activists, and they persuaded him to take on the cause of abolition. And his involvement here was motivated by a desire to put Christian principles into action. So again, he was coming out of this first great awakening mindset, that you can't have a disconnect between what you say you believe and what you live out. And he was horrified by what he perceived was a depraved and unchristian trade and the greed and avarice of the owners and traders. And he also sensed the call from God, and he wrote in a journal in 1787, God has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners, which in today's vernacular would mean moral values. And he didn't see a disconnect between those two. In fact, he saw them as being two sides of the same thing. So he was convinced of the importance of religion, morality, and education, and he spent the rest of his life working to improve all three in the United Kingdom. So let's talk a little bit more about morals as William Wilberforce understood it. So he wrote a book called A Practical View of Christianity, where he laid out his views. And he said that the problem in England in the 18th century was that the people had a fatal habit of considering Christian morals as distinct from Christian doctrines. So, the idea here is that, you may have a Christian moral that says a husband and a wife, people should get married before they engage in sexual activity and get married. But if you disconnect that moral from the Christian doctrines, and for him, doctrines would be those things like human depravity, divine judgment, substitutionary work of Christ on the cross, justification by faith alone, regeneration of the Holy Spirit, and the practical necessity of fruit in a life devoted to good deeds. If you don't have that as the bedrock behind those morals, that moral system is destined to fail. And he said that was what was happening in England in the 1700s. So there was a cultural reformation going on in England, and Wilberforce was one of the major agents of change. So there's this quote here from Pollock, who wrote about him, and he said, "There's little doubt that Wilberforce changed the moral outlook of Great Britain. The Reformation of morals grew into Victorian virtues, and Wilberforce touched the world when he made goodness fashionable." If you contrast the late 18th century with its loose morals and corrupt public life with the mid-19th century, whatever its faults, 19th century British public life became famous for its emphasis on character, morals, and justice, and the British business world famous for integrity. So Wilberforce helped to change British culture society, and then that British society demanded the abolition of slavery. So let's dig a little deeper into Wilberforce's ideas about sin. So he said, sin hurts people, so don't sin. Wouldn't that definition of sin be good for society? This is just practical. So he's actually arguing with a lot of humanists who want to completely disconnect God from morality. So he's saying, okay, on a practical side, let's just say sin hurts people, so don't sin. But again, he brings in this idea that without reverence for the divine majesty, without that kind of wisdom, there will be no deep and lasting good done for man, spiritually or politically. So therefore, we must always say that the good of society may never be put ahead of this idea that we must have reverence for the divine majesty God, because that would dishonor God and paradoxically defeat the good of society. Therefore, for the good of society must not be the primary good. Basically, he is arguing that to really have long-lasting improvements in the moral character of society, you can't dictate it. You can't just legislate it. It has to come from a true reverence of God. So short term, sure, you can legislate good behavior, but if it's really going to be lasting, God has to be in it, and it's only his regenerative power that will really bring about the change that you want. So we must always put God at the forefront, and sort of these practical ideas for society as secondary to that. Now, Wilberforce became a power in the Parliament after he sought the advice of John Newton. And Newton told him, yes, you need to live out your Christian morals and do it through your position in Parliament. And he fought against the British slave trade for 20 years until finally the passage of the Slave Trade Act of 1807. And then further, he supported the campaign to completely abolish slavery. And even after he had to leave Parliament because of health issues, it finally was passed, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which completely abolished slavery in the British Empire. And not only was it, British citizens now could no longer hold slaves, which they were paid for. The British Empire actually put aside funds to compensate slave holders. But now the British Navy, the greatest power in the world, actively enforced the ban within its empire. And politically, it tried to manipulate and coerce other countries to give up slavery. So, it wasn't just this one little country made this decision. This was the world power. And they tried to use their military might and their political force to further abolition. And I think we need to take a step back here and just realize the enormity of what transpired. Slavery had been the default for countless thousands of years in the world, and nobody even questioned its morality. And now here at this seminal moment in history, a people decided, no, this was an absolutely imperative moral issue, and they had to end it. Why did it take so many thousands of years for people to come to this conclusion? What was different? What was unique? What was special about this time? And like I said, there were humanists, people who didn't even believe in God who came to this conclusion coming out of the Renaissance. But, I think what we really need to also realize is that it was the hearts of the British people that were convinced. This wasn't just legislated down to them. The majority of the people had already been convinced that this was an absolute imperative. And that was so radical in the history of the world. Now, because Kendi did such a good job of showing how many of the racist ideas dehumanized blacks, I thought I would show this because one of the major points of emphasis of the abolitionist movement in England was the rehumanization of blacks. So this particular emblem was used by them. And, the caption says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So partly what they were doing was combating those racist ideas and helping everyone to understand that one's skin color is completely irrelevant when we're talking about the value of a human being. So now I'd like to get us back into concentrating on America, the United States. So I'm just going to introduce two competing views about that. One of them is the 1619 Project, which was initiated by New York Times Magazine. And it's all about the 400th anniversary of the beginning of slavery in America, according to them, which they say was 1619. Although historically, actually, slaves arrived into the United States and South Carolina in 1526 in a Spanish colony. But that's not really the point. The point is that for them, 1776 Declaration of Independence is actually divisive because our founding fathers were all a bunch of racists. So they go back to 1619 and they say, this is what was important for our nation. That's when blacks came. Opposing that view is the 1776 Unites campaign. And this is mostly a bunch of black Americans who say no, that the founding virtues and values were not racist, that those are what the country is built upon and what are beneficial for people of all color. And what we need to do is just concentrate on those ideas of equality which are built into it. And certainly there were flaws of the founding fathers. There are flaws of everybody, but we need to concentrate on those positive aspects of 1776 instead of the ones that divide us. So just a couple of good resources that you can do your own comparison and contrasting with. Now, one of the books that I think really helps us to fill in a lot of the gaps from what Stamped from the Beginning presented is this book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. And as he states in the book, quoting from Booker T. Washington, many Americans of that era who saw slavery as evil saw a race war as a greater evil. So, you know, why did the founding fathers not just immediately outlaw, completely ban slavery? You know, people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Well, the issue is so many of them saw if they tried to do that, to forcibly do that, they would come up against people like Jefferson Davis, and it would simply create a war. And even if you could convince all the whites to go about doing that, they were very afraid that there would still be a war between whites and blacks because blacks had been mistreated so badly for so long. So there were practical aspects that were keeping them from being what Kendi would say is a true anti-racist. So, as Booker T. Washington said, these people, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, saw slavery as an evil that could be tolerated only in fear of these greater evils. And even people like Robert E. Lee declared in 1856, long before the Civil War, that he regarded slavery as an evil that he wished to see somehow gradually ended. And that's one of the reasons why Abraham Lincoln actually asked Lee if he would lead the Union Army. So let's look a little bit more at George Washington, because he's one of the characters that Kendi specifically pointed out as not being willing to be an anti-racist. If you look at Washington's writings, you can see that for him, the moral principle was easy. Slavery is bad, it's wrong. But figuring out how to apply that in practice with all of these other constraints was not. Now you got to remember, this was a country that fought a Revolutionary War and then had this very disparate set of 13 states that it was trying to hold together. And at the same time, you've got this very divisive issue of slavery. But that doesn't mean that George Washington didn't do anything. He freed all of his slaves in his will, and he provided for them. Many of them were taken care of for years by his estate. He made sure that they were taught to read and write and trained in occupations. And when he made trips to the north, like into places like Philadelphia, he would take slaves with him, but he wouldn't bring them back. So on the sly, he was actually, part of the Underground Railroad. So this is a man who didn't just say slavery is bad, he took practical steps against it. Now let's talk a little bit more about Thomas Jefferson. So most scholars anymore want to concentrate on either the hypocrisy of siring children with his slave Sally Hemings or some of the racist contemplations of the capacities of blacks in his writings. And as I've mentioned, one thing that's kind of unusual about Thomas Jefferson is just that he wrote so prolifically that there's just lots of material to look at. But a lot of people dismiss some of the anti-slavery words that he had. And that's true of all the founding fathers. And they didn't just talk, they also acted. In Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, it criticized King George III for having enslaved Africans and for overriding colonial Virginians' attempt to ban slavery. Now, we already saw that in Stamped from the Beginning, that Jefferson had even put in that sort of language in some letters to the king prior to this. And some people thought it was just a political ploy. But when you look at the fact that when Jefferson drafted the state constitution for Virginia in 1776, his draft included a clause prohibiting any more importation of slaves. And in 1783, he included a new draft for the Virginia Constitution that would gradually emancipate slaves. Now, he was defeated in both of these efforts, but it wasn't just some political ploy that he used in the Declaration of Independence. He continued to put that sort of legislation forth in the state of Virginia. Now, we also saw that he did have some doubts about the mental capacity of blacks. But if you read further into some of his writings, it says, "My doubts were the result of personal observation on the limited sphere of my own state, where the opportunities for the development of their genius were not favorable, and those of exercising it still less slow. I expressed them, therefore, with great hesitation, but whatever their degree of talent, it is no measure of their rights. Because Sir Isaac Newton was superior to others in understanding, he was not therefore lord of the person or property of others." So clearly, Jefferson knew that he only had a limited understanding of the black capacity. And he actually did encounter some other blacks who had great talent later on in life. Now, another reason for the hesitation of a lot of those founding fathers to really fight slavery is this idea of fear. And this statement says that deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites and 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained made the peaceful coexistence of these two large populations in the South unlikely in his judgment. More likely, he thought, were convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race. And Madison also had similar ideas, and that's why they often supported this idea of colonization. So they weren't right in that, but it was a legitimate fear because of what transpired in Haiti. So let's take a more bird's eye view of the American slave trade. So the first Africans who arrived in North America mostly arrived as indentured servants. It wasn't until around 1640 when a Negro was sentenced to lifetime slavery for attempting to run away that you really started the institutional race slavery that existed up until the 1860s. And by the time of the American Revolutions, it definitely was institutionalized. But even as far back as 1688, German and Dutch Quakers organized protests against slavery. And then right after the Declaration of Independence in 1777, Vermont abolished slavery. And all of the northern states had abolished it by 1804. And then under Jefferson, the slave trade became illegal in 1808. And there were many American abolitionists who took an active role in opposing slavery by supporting the Underground Railroad. And there were also violent clashes between anti-slavery and post-slavery Americans, including Bleeding Kansas. So, this idea that everybody in America was just racist and supporting slavery isn't borne out by the facts. But it certainly is true that in the South, the domestic slave trade continued at a rapid pace, and it really was the development of cotton plantations in the Deep South that drove it. The notions that Jefferson and Washington had that slavery might just die out on its own were really based on the agriculture that they knew, and cotton was just completely different. And the treatment of slaves varied quite widely in the United States. It certainly was the worst on those large rural plantations with unskilled labor. But small slave-owning families, especially those in cities, had much closer relationships with their slaves. And this is just a matter of practicality. If And even on a plantation, if you have some slaves who are feeding you your meal, you're unlikely to be treating them all that poorly because they can very easily poison you. But the bulk of the slaves were certainly those treated poorly who were just doing the hard menial labor of the cotton on the cotton plantations. To get an idea of the numbers, the 1860 census showed that roughly 400,000 individuals, representing 8% of all U.S. families, owned nearly 4 million slaves. And that represents about 1/3 of Southern families. Well, about 1/3 of Southern families owned slaves. That's not the 8%. Now, the election of President Lincoln brought secession and the Civil War because most of the South viewed it as that, the the North was going to be pushing for an end to slavery, even though that really wasn't the platform that Lincoln was elected on. But there were also other things, there was a cotton tax, but the main issue was definitely slavery. Then between 1861 and 1865, during the Civil War, it's estimated as many as 750,000 soldiers died, and that doesn't even count civilians. And by some estimates, 10% of all Northern men between 20 and 45 died, and 30% of all Southern white men aged 18 to 40 were killed. And slaves in the Confederate States were legally emancipated in 1863. Now, one of the themes that we've been following through all of this is the importance of books, types of media in changing the mindsets of people. And one of the primary ones that fueled the abolitionist movement in the Civil War was Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was an 1852 novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she was a Connecticut-born teacher from a Hartford female seminary, an active abolitionist, and her book featured the character of Uncle Tom, who was a long-suffering black slave. And there were a lot of other stories that revolve around Uncle Tom. And it depicted the reality of slavery, the harsh treatment, but it also asserted that Christian love can overcome something as destructive as enslavement. It was the best-selling novel of the 19th century and the second best-selling book of that century following the Bible. However, today it is actually looked on quite negatively because of some stereotypes that it was one of the first to popularize. So the affectionate, dark-skinned mammy, which also showed up in movies like Gone with the Wind, and then the pickaninny stereotype of black children, and then the Uncle Tom, that dutiful, long-suffering servant who's faithful to his master. And it's common today for the term Uncle Tom to be used in a very negative sense to refer to a black person who is adopting the white mindset. But all of this just it totally neglects and overshadows the historical importance of this book as just a vital anti-slavery tool. So post-war, many blacks in the North were actually assimilated and lived and went to school with whites. Now, there was certainly some prejudice and some backlash by envious whites, but most of that occurred a bit later, after 1900. most Southern blacks, which is 90% of all of them, they stayed in the South. Many of them worked as sharecroppers. You know, most had hoped, after like Sherman's march to the sea, he had said that each black family should be given 40 acres and a mule, and many, were like, "Oh, great," but very few did. And then there was a plan where, the the North would confiscate many of the large Southern plantations, and they were going to auction them off. And blacks saved up money to buy them. But then there were these Northern carpetbaggers who would come down with a bag full of money and buy the plantations for more money than the blacks had. And then they would just hire the blacks as sharecroppers. So all this was rather depressing for the black families who made it through slavery, and now we're free. And the president certainly didn't help. Lincoln was assassinated, and President Johnson, he said the blacks had less capacity for government than any other race of people. So he was not very supportive. And also at this time, the Supreme Court was not favorable towards blacks, and they struck down many laws that protected them. But Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, and he started turning things around. Right at the end of the war, the KKK was trying to assert its power, suppress black vote, put the blacks back in their place. Well, Grant confronted them, and the lynchings. But towards the end of his second term, there were a lot of scandals in his government, and that really worked against him, and he lost a lot of power. There were also economic forces at work that were helping to gradually increase the wages of the blacks. You can just think, you have these carpetbaggers who bought up the plantations, and they are hiring the workers as sharecroppers. Well, whoever pays the most is going to get the best quality of labor. So that's where they would gravitate to. So, just because of regular market forces, there was at least a slight uptick in the wages of the blacks while Grant was in power. And then in 1870, the 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote. And again, that was one of the issues for the KKK, was to try and suppress that vote. And once the Northern troops left the South, that really became a big problem. And further, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 empowered African Americans with protections in terms of public accommodations. So during this time period, there were some positive legislation and protections for them. However, as we mentioned, there were a lot of issues with the KKK, other groups called the Red Shirts from Mississippi and the Carolinas, the White League in Louisiana. They were just relying on intimidation tactics to suppress black vote, especially in the 1877 race between Hayes and Tilden. So Tilden actually won the popular vote. However, he only had 184 votes, electoral votes, and needed 185 for victory. But there are 3 states that were in dispute. Well, finally, Hayes' party leaders offered the Southerners a deal. If Hayes were allowed to become president, then they would remove the remaining Union troops from the South. And that was agreed upon, but as you can imagine, the African Americans referred to it as the Great Betrayal, because those federal troops, Union troops, were protecting the blacks from groups like the KKK and the Red Shirts. So here, we have a graph over on the left, just a bar chart, and right after the Civil War, like I said, there were a lot of KKK activities, some massacres. Then we see that gradually decreasing because of things like um, Grant becoming president, but still quite a few of them going on. But then, in 1890, we see a big uptick, and that's when Jim Crow laws were passed. So enforcing those became a big issue. So, leading up into 1900, again, big resurgence in this. And the dominant political narrative of the day blamed lynchings on the victims, insisting that, brutal mob violence was the only appropriate response to the growing scourge of black men raping white women. And the Equal Justice Initiative has this quote from Teddy Roosevelt that says, "The greatest existing cause of lynching is the perpetration, especially by black men, of the hideous crime of rape." Now, when I read that, I was actually a little bit surprised because I knew that Teddy Roosevelt actually had many black friends and he entertained Booker T. Washington. So I tried to look up. I tried to look up the history of all of this, and indeed, um, while Roosevelt was governor of New York, he frequently had black guests. And when he moved into the White House, he invited Booker T. Washington, who was working as his advisor, and they dined with his family. Now, it did provoke an outpouring of condemnation from Southern politicians and press. Now, if you aren't aware of Booker T. Washington, he is a really excellent guy to study. He was born a slave, and his family was emancipated. He ended up moving into West Virginia. He got educated, then he got a college education. He was one of those who, was helped out by many of the church educators. At the end of the Civil War, 2,500 Northern female missionaries headed south to educate blacks. And he was one of those that benefited from that. So, and he obviously was an extremely intelligent person himself. He didn't start his schooling, I think, until 9, but he caught up very quickly. And after he became educated, he started the Tuskegee Institute. And by the way, he went to college at Hampton Institute, all right, and then to Wayland Seminary. Now, one of the reasons that Booker T. Washington is very much disliked by the anti-racist community today is because in 1895, as lynchings were really accelerating, he gave a speech known as the Atlanta Compromise, and it called for black progress through education and entrepreneurship rather than trying to directly challenge Jim Crow. So, he was a supporter of racial uplift. This idea that, if we, in many ways, change our cultural attitudes, change our educational level, we will convince the white man that, we can compete with them on every level. However, he also secretly supported court challenges to segregation and restrictions on voter registration. But he's most known for trying to work with the black community to help them get educated and help them succeed in the marketplace. But because he wasn't one of these, full force, political avengers trying to end segregation, he really isn't looked at very favorably by the anti-racist community. But anyway, back to the point, he was good friends with Teddy Roosevelt. So, digging a little bit deeper, I found Teddy Roosevelt's State of the Union address from 1906, and that's actually where the quote comes from that the Equal Justice Initiative quoted. So in this, he calls attention to the epidemic of lynching and mob violence that springs up. And when we deal with, lynching, even a speck is necessary. And a great many white men are lynched, but the crime is particularly frequent in respect to black men. Now, this first point may actually seem odd to you, but lynching was a very common practice in the South, even prior to the Civil War. There just was a lot of lawlessness in the South that was dealt with by vigilante groups and mob violence. You just never saw black men being lynched until, well, at least not very often, until the Civil War, because most of them were slaves, and slaves were so valuable. An able-bodied young slave, could have been worth, $50,000 in today's money. So you don't go on and lynch that. But after the Civil War, the majority of the lynchings switched over to the blacks, but there still were those of white men going on. And that's what the context in which Roosevelt said the greatest existing cause of lynching is the perpetration, especially by black men, of the hideous crime of rape. And that was also the primary reason why a lot of white men had been lynched. But going on, he says, while a considerable proportion of the individuals lynched are innocent of all crime, so he admits that this mob violence isn't getting it right. And then he quotes from Governor Candler of Georgia, who stated on one occasion some years ago, "I can say of a verity that I have within the last month saved the lives of half a dozen innocent Negroes." And this is the governor of Georgia. And then later on, he says, "Every Christian patriot in America needs to lift up his voice in loud and eternal protest against the mob spirit that is threatening the integrity of this republic." And then he quotes from the governor of Alabama, Governor Jelks. He has recently spoken as follows: "The lynching of any person for whatever crime is inexcusable anywhere. It is a defiance of orderly government. But the killing of innocent people under any provocation is infinitely more horrible." Furthermore, he said, "Any crime committed by a member of one race against a member of another race is avenged in such a fashion that it seems as if not the individual criminal, but the whole race is attacked. The result is to exasperate to the highest degree race feeling. There is but one safe rule in dealing with black men as with white men. It is the same rule that must be applied in dealing with rich men and poor men. That is, to treat each man, whatever his color, his creed, or his social position, with even-handed justice on his real worth as a man." And then finally, "Evil will surely come in the end to both races if we substitute for this just rule the habit of treating all the members of the race, good and bad, alike." And then in closing, "Let no man take part in the torture of a human being without having his own moral nature permanently lowered. Every lynching means just so much moral deterioration in all the children who have any knowledge of it, and therefore just so much additional trouble for the next generation of Americans. Let justice be both sure and swift, but let justice be under the law, and not with the wild and crooked savagery of a mob." So these are the complete words of Teddy Roosevelt. And I think when they're taken in context, we see that he understood that every man deserved justice, whether rich or poor or white or black. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the origin of that culture of lynching. So I already said that, it certainly predates the Civil War, and it's mostly a Southern phenomenon. So Thomas Sowell, in his book Black Rednecks, traces this back, and he has a quote in there that I have for you here at the start. It says, these people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job. They flout the law constantly and neglect their children. They drink too much, and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. For some reason or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life. So this quote actually comes from a newspaper in 1956 in Indianapolis about poor whites from the South. And many whites were discriminated against based on their Southern drawl. That was what was used to identify them. And if you wonder, where does this come from? We often see these movies like Gone with the Wind, and we have these elegant and debonair Southern plantation owners. That's probably more of a Hollywood myth than a reality. Now, certainly most of them were probably still more refined than the Hatfields and the McCoys were, but you know, think about everything that happened in that particular example. You have people over slights who are trying to kill each other. Perhaps a stolen pig started it. You have people making moonshine. You have people who are having children out of wedlock. You have multiple instances of knife fights, gun fights, people who don't seem to be doing a whole lot of work, just getting into all kinds of trouble. And one thing I want to say about the Hatfields and McCoys is that I've actually met some modern day Hatfields and McCoys, and none of them are anywhere like that. And you could even make the argument that some of the Hatfields and McCoys towards the end of their lives became saved, and they weren't like that themselves. So there's always the possibility for somebody to change. But McCoy is clearly a Scottish name, and in Black Rednecks, that sort of culture is traced back to the borderlands of England. So most of the South was actually the descendants of people who immigrated to the United States from those borderlands of England, places like Scotland, and they did it before the Scottish Enlightenment. So even though Scotland had this major intellectual and social advancement that occurred in the 1800s, that didn't happen in the United States. And they also brought with them this English that is strange. Okay, so Southern whites spoke English differently from whites in other regions. And, we even carry with us today some of the language that comes from that, things like Ewans. Also, their churches were different. And even today, Southerners are much more likely to talk about church, to say that it's something good, but not actually go. Southern roads were very different. They weren't kept up like they were in the North. Their homes were very different. The music, the education, the food, their sex lives, they were all sharply different from those of other whites. And this history of the redneck or cracker culture is more than a curiosity. It has contemporary significance because of its influence on the economic and social evolution of vast numbers of people. So obviously, whites in Appalachia today still follow many of these same practices. But the interesting thing is that Sowell connects that up with millions of blacks in the ghettos, which is why the book is called Black Rednecks. If we look a little bit deeper at the origins of this redneck and cracker culture from the Scottish and English borderlands prior to 1800, we see that those areas were really poor and backward, and it was an unsettled time when the Scots and English were just fighting lots of wars. There were many documented atrocities over centuries, really. and it was mostly led by feuding clans and marauders. Very few times was it, like organized war. But it's just a constant state of uproar. And in these kind of unsettled times, it's not that surprising that people were really disorderly and living in a deeply disordered land. That the world was one of impotent laws, daily dangers, and lives that could be snuffed out at any moment. So trying to snatch whatever fleeting pleasures presented themselves is kind of understandable, and that's the world of these English borderlands prior to the 1800s, and many Southerners came from this. But despite the uncivilized manner in which people in these borderlands were living, it did turn around. Eventually, the Scots were completely conquered by the English and eventually absorbed. And because of the contacts with England, there was improvements in agriculture and ability. The Bank of Scotland was formed. A complete network of schools was developed in the lowlands. The highlands still lagged behind, but at least in the lowlands there was organized education. And by the end of the century, Edinburgh's medical school was arguably one of the leading centers of science in Europe. And in the 18th century, Scotland reaped the intellectual benefits of this system. So I think it's important for us to realize that that kind of uncivilized culture within 100 150 years was completely turned around. It's not like it has to be persistent. It can be turned around. However, those cracker values persisted in the South, and let's just touch on some of those patterns. They included things like an aversion to work, proneness to violence, neglect of education, sexual promiscuity, improvidence, drunkenness, lack of entrepreneurship, reckless searches for excitement, lively music and dance, and a style of religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric, unbridled emotions, and flamboyant imagery. And many of that even poured over into their politics. But these were just the people of touchy pride, vanity, and boastful self-dramatization. And this really just baffled people from outside of the South. There's an example here, just somebody who didn't start work on time, and the Englishman was going to have somebody else do it, and he's like, tomorrow I'm going to come with 20 men with rifles, and it'll be your life or mine. So you can see, New Englanders were just baffled at this kind of pride among the crackers. They wouldn't accept any slight whatsoever, even if it was really due. And the duel was primarily a Southern convention. And you think of Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Aaron Burr was from the South. And even though Alexander Hamilton wasn't even born in the United States, many Northerners, many people who weren't from the South were just caught up in that system. But the duel was very common amongst the South. And it poured over into their politics. So this is actually a political cartoon from 1860, and it shows a northerner having an argument, and he's got the pen in his hand, and the southerner is from the club, and he's beating people with a club. There are other depictions of southern politicians of the era with a pen in one hand and a dueling pistol in the other. So this kind of violence that grew out of that pride, it had social approval in the South. So men were just often killed and went free in the South, just as they had kind of in the earlier times in those English borderlands of Ireland and Scotland. And when stories of these were told in court in a community where it wasn't strange for men to carry about, got weapons and to try to defend themselves as they were feeling, the the people in the court would just say, "Oh, I would do the same thing." So it was common for them to get free, to be set free. So again, this, when we have depictions of people like Alexis de Tocqueville, when he was traveling through the United States and he remarked on Southern courts, he was just amazed at the dysfunction of those courts. To rural Southerners, rather than a set of legal statutes, rule of law, justice remained a matter of societal norms, and people took it upon themselves to enforce it. So, I think with that background, the the notion that the cracker culture led to lynching is pretty convincing. And as I said before, most lynchings in antebellum South, before the Civil War, were actually of whites. So the fact that that poured over into blacks isn't surprising to us. And that Southern vigilante violence had just been a tradition for centuries, even going back to Britain. And it just carried over this idea of retributive justice, where private individuals would take it into their own hands. And even organizations like the Ku Klux Klan were just feeding on that tradition, born out of that tradition. And even the the notion of cross burning, it goes back to Scotland and the notion of the fiery cross of old Scotland. It was used by feuding clans to call the people together to have one of their clan fights. And the the first depiction of a burning cross with the KKK was actually in a movie called The Birth of the Nation. So was The Birth of a Nation, just any ordinary movie? No. I mean, this was a spectacle, a major motion picture, the first of its kind. Now, the original title was The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan. So The Birth of a Nation probably appealed to a lot more people and got them to go see it. But because it was so innovative in cinematography, it attracted a lot of people, and then they heard this message. So what it said in 1915 was that African Americans, many played in blackface, were unintelligent and sexually aggressive toward white women. And the film portrays the KKK as this heroic force necessary to preserve American values and a white supremacist social order. And because of this landmark in film history, a 3-hour epic with many characters and lots of action scenes, it was just very popular. And to underscore that, it was the first American motion picture to be screened in the White House, viewed by President Woodrow Wilson. So, this was a widely disseminated, widely seen movie, and lots of people were ingesting this portrayal. And in the midst of these, Southern thoughts about the dangers of blacks, we have the Great Migration that's going on. So, yeah, it really started, late 1800s, but it was around the two world wars that it really accelerated. Now, prior to 1900, hostility and discrimination toward blacks in northern cities really declined, eh, very significantly. There was no segregation in housing or education. If you look at most newspapers that talk about, blacks and whites, they're very positive. But then, as you have this migration, there's a resurgence in the north of hostility. And based on what we've already seen about that redneck cracker culture, and then ideas being fueled by things like the Birth of a Nation movie, you can see this isn't just some inexplicable swing of the pendulum in the white public opinion. Instead you have masses of blacks arriving in the North at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th, and they're bringing that redneck cracker culture with them. And even in black newspapers of the time, they were denounced for their crudeness, violence, and crime. And you can see depictions where people say, we're not one of them people from the South, one of those blacks from the South. So it's not just a question of perception or stereotypes based on color. It really was a culture that was coming up. And we started out this section talking about same sort of statements were made about the Southern whites, and they were discriminated against based on their Southern drawl. And these blacks were being discriminated against because of their color, just assuming they're all bringing this cracker culture with them. But the northern blacks were upset because they were getting categorized with these southern blacks. But what's really ironic is today, even today, we have people who cling to this counterproductive culture in the name of group pride. They won't change because they say, oh, that would be self-hate. But all of these patterns of crudeness, violence, crime, sexual promiscuity, they have a track record of destruction. They don't justify any optimism whatsoever. So, what matters is evidence over ideology, history, or business. Now, because of this influx, segregation in the North even became the norm. And it's fueled because of two main factors. One, this peculiar Southern culture is coming, and the people who were in power, mayors of cities, simply didn't want that to overwhelm the existing culture, so they would separate out the peoples. The other is just kind of a practical matter and a fear of war, well, maybe not full out war, but fights breaking out between the two groups. Again, because, this Southern culture, it's bringing with it, or at least conceptually bringing with it, to the Northerners, this idea of an unruly people who take the law into their own hands, that they're always, they might be carrying guns and they'll fight. So, just separate the groups just so you don't have that potential for violence. And this isn't true just of whites and blacks. In New York City, it was very well known that the Irish and the Italians would often fight. So they were deliberately separated. And you get into uh, the Depression era, and many men were taken to work in the Civilian Conservation Corps. And again, it became obvious that the Irish and Italians would fight, so they made sure that they were not kept in the same camps. So it's just a matter of practicality of trying to keep groups that you think might fight apart. But in the midst of all of this, there were still outbreaks of violence occurring in the North. And one such outbreak of violence is what started the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. There was an attack in Springfield, Illinois in 1908, and it shocked many Northerners. And it also demonstrated that lynching was not just a Southern phenomenon, which shouldn't have been surprising. Teddy Roosevelt had already talked about it. And so when the NAACP was launched in 1910, the president, the treasurer, the board chair, and the secretary were all white men. And it was one of the first in the United States that had white men, black men, white females, black females working side by side on a public level to speak out against things like lynching. And they even tried to get the movie Birth of a Nation banned. Now, although they were primarily against lynching, they failed to get any legislation passed. It was many years later before that actually was accomplished. White Southerners, in response, formed the Committee on Interracial Cooperation, and in 1930, it launched the Association of Southern Women to Prevent Lynching. And by 1937, Gallup polls showed overwhelming white support for anti-lynching legislation. So this is just to show, even in the South, there were many people who, realized that this violence and this lynching was wrong, and they stood up to speak out against it. Now, going back to the idea of the Great Migration, as I said, it really accelerated around World War I. So if you look at the table down here in the bottom right, and you look at the percentage of blacks living in the South, it really didn't change all that much until you get to 1910 to 1920. So almost 90% of blacks lived in the South up until 1910, but then that drops to 85% in 1920 and 79% in 1930. Then levels off again during the Depression years, 1930 to 1940, and then another big acceleration around World War II. And then levels off again at around 53% after the kind of war years. And so we see that many people were leaving the South because of that violence and those lynchings, those insecurities that people had in the South. They were trying to flee that, and many people come to the United States even today because they are trying to escape that kind of lawlessness where they are. So it's not surprising at all that that is what drove many blacks to leave. But if we again look at this bar chart on the left, we can see that the number of lynchings has dropped off dramatically. It did drop off dramatically after those war years, but it still didn't go to zero. And that's ultimately what you're after. And that brings us up to what I believe are issues that are still persistent and relevant for us today. So the next time, what we're going to do is use these two books as jumping off points to discuss important topics. The first one is segregation. The Color of Law documents how it was really codified into the laws of the time in even the North, this practice called redlining, and those were the sections of cities where blacks could live. And we all know that even today, that segregated neighborhoods are still the norm in many cities. And then the other will be a discussion about justice or injustice, and we'll use Bryan Stevenson's movie Just Mercy to talk about that. And Bryan Stevenson was a lawyer who started the Equal Justice Initiative, and the book is primarily about the story of one black man who was convicted of murder and put on death row for a crime that he didn't commit. And eventually Bryan was able to get him off. But he started that Equal Justice Initiative, which has had gotten into many different areas of this whole idea of justice. And so we wanted to explore that topic using this book to help us start that. So we'll do that next time.